Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Volos. Welcome to University of Thessaly. It's a pleasure to welcome you all in this three-day event about educational commons and active social inclusion. And I'd like to start by saying that this international conference is organized by the Horizon 2020 research project SMOOTH, and of course University of Thessaly, who is the coordinator of this project, in order to bring together researchers, practitioners, teachers and students, civil society organizations, activists, journalists and policymakers to discuss the challenges and opportunities of a commons-oriented education to reverse inequalities, to present good practices, and to inform political decision-making processes. The main goal of this conference is to discuss the implications of the commons for refiguring education and for social change in general on a footing of equality, sharing, caring, and freedom. Although the commoning practices and the commons are not a new phenomenon, in recent years, there is a renaissance of the commons in all sectors of social life. However, it is noteworthy that empirical and theoretical research on educational commons is quite limited compared to other forms of the commons, such as environmental or natural commons, urban commons, digital commons, despite the fact that education is a cardinal or a core institution of contemporary societies and has a key function of both social reproduction and social change. The lack or the deficit of empirical data about the commoning practices in education has led to a series of empirical studies in formal and non-formal educational settings. And specifically from 2021, in the context of the SMOOTH project, systematic research has been carried out in several European countries to study whether educational commons can address and reverse inequalities. In particular, around 50 case studies have been implemented in formal and non-formal spaces in 8 different countries: Greece, Belgium, Estonia, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Sweden. The case studies are planned to be experimental, open and contingent, and designed according to the logic and ethics of the commons. The main aim was to study whether, as I said before, whether the logic of the commons can be transferred to the educational field and contribute to tackling inequalities. Also, to make the special lived experience of the people involved, the commoners, let's say, evident. In so doing, we described rituals, practices, and mentalities produced within these alternative educational social spaces and provided an understanding of how alternative children's subjectivities and citizenship come into being. And all these practices were deemed as micro-political attempts to build open, participatory, democratic spaces for being and becoming in the here and the now. And the goal is to discuss the differences and similarities between independent and hybrid types of educational commons developed in formal school education institutions, as well as to discuss the constraints and opportunities in each situation, and subsequently their consequences for the participants, children, young people, parents or guardians, and teachers, educators, and society, of course. So, the aim of the conference is to deepen and advance the emergent field of educational commons by discussing if educational commons can serve as a catalyst for reversing inequalities and as an inclusionary strategy for children and youth at risk of social exclusion in Europe, and how educational commons can contribute to the reversal of inequalities. And all these questions will be answered by more than 120 presenters, as well as the keynote speakers, who will take the floor immediately after me. Thank you very much for attending this event, and welcome again.
Hello, everybody. Just to introduce you to our keynote speakers. Unfortunately, Sevastime Anolas will not be here. She had hit her leg and she couldn't travel. So the discussion today with our two keynote speakers will be about contemporary challenges and educational commons. And we have with us Noah Delisovoi, who is a professor at the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the College of Education of the University of Texas at Austin. Noah's research focuses on critical and emancipatory approaches to pedagogy, curriculum, and cultural studies. He is particularly interested in problems posed for educators by globalization, the intersecting effects of race, class, and capital in schools and society. And Jordi Collet-Sabet, I hope I pronounce it well, Jordi, is an associate professor of sociology of education at the University of Vic and honorary senior research associate at the Institute of Education, University College London. He is also a researcher at the Group of Educational Research of Vic University. Jordi does research in sociology of education, family and community relationships, education inequalities, and education policy. So thanks a lot. The floor is yours, and we can also have more time for discussion after the presentations, or we can discuss after the two presentations all together. Thanks a lot.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Yes, is that good? Okay. Thank you, Alekos, for the introduction. I want to thank Alekos Pantasis for welcoming me to the conference, being very supportive. I appreciate that very much. And also to Yannis Pektelidis for opening up the conference and for the invitation to be here. And also to the other members of the organizing committee, Maria Rinu, and all of the other people who have done all of the work to prepare for this remarkable gathering, such an important event. It's such a privilege to be here with you in this beautiful place. And I'm glad to be able to share a few thoughts with you this evening. Now, I should say, of course, that I am speaking from the context of the United States, where I work. And I know that your main concerns are with Europe, naturally enough, in this conference. And I hope that some of what I have to share from where I work is useful to you. I think it can be interesting to share perspectives from different sites, right? And that can be mutually enriching. And I know there's connections and there's also differences. So that's interesting to think about. So I did want to note that, and I'm very excited to learn from you all about the work you've been doing here. I'm going to read my presentation, and the reason for that is that I am careful about what I say, and I want to be sure that I get to my key points. All right? So I will jump in here. And the title is The Political and Educational Commons in Transition. I believe that our consideration of the commons in society and education has to be contextualized within current conditions. Increasingly, capitalism is faced with a series of fundamental crises that the system itself has produced, which have characteristic expressions on the terrain of politics. Climate change, economic polarization, and increasing authoritarianism, for instance, are diverse problems that work across different domains. However, each of these crises is ultimately an effect of capitalism's essential accumulative drive, and each is an expression of the system's increasing inability to organize itself in sustainable and even coherent terms. Unfortunately, these crises by themselves do not automatically precipitate alternative and emancipatory counter-paradigms. We have to do the hard work of imagining and experimenting with these alternatives, as the Smooth Project itself is doing. However, there is an ever greater urgency for the project of creating modes of radical democratic commons, both for the sake of fundamental social survival and also for the sake of preserving the possibility of a minimal ethical core for human being. In this connection, education is a crucial site for experiments in commoning, not only due to its central role in social reproduction, but also because education necessarily implies an incipient solidarity, the solidarity of collective imagination, even if that condition is often distorted in schools into unhelpful and even oppressive forms. So, the commons is usually understood as communally held and organized resources, land, and identities that have been appropriated by developing capitalism. Contemporary projects oriented toward the commons have sought to create new autonomous and convivial communities against contemporary enclosures. But I also believe that it's important to put these social processes in even larger historical context. Contemporary economic predations repeat in a new register the plunder undertaken by the West on a global scale since the early modern period. The destabilization that neoliberal privatization produces echoes the disruptions of global societies by colonialism. These are two moments in a continuous history of dispossession. Furthermore, as in colonialism, neoliberal enclosures occupy the very time of life and evict other possibilities, even where the degree of violence is nothing like that of earlier periods. For instance, the overwhelming of public education in the present by scripted curricula governed by standardized assessment and punitive accountability frameworks is as much an ontological invasion of the being of students, teachers, and learning as it is an ideological offensive. And I can tell you that in the United States now, testing absolutely dominates the experience of schooling for children in public schools. If it's not testing, it's test preparation, right? And this is not just an ideological cognitive project, it reorganizes the whole experience of schooling, right? Capitalism from this perspective is not just the unfolding drama of a set of already constituted figures, but rather the installation of a more basic imaginary that depends for its continued preservation on an annexation of being and knowing. From this perspective, enclosures of the commons and the establishment of the global capitalist market enroll communities and individuals into a new universe organized on the basis of imposition. Colonialism inaugurated not just a new form of rule, but also a new spiritual grammar whose forms and phrases are invasions and erasures. The social world that we inhabit today is the effect of this imposition, and the deep collaboration that is aimed for in projects of commoning must confront it in order to begin to elaborate alternatives. So as I've been saying, I'm interested in putting the conversation around the commons into larger perspective and considering the deep history even of colonialism as it affects our lives today and how we think about commons in that broad context. And I'm going to make a few remarks on how we might rethink the commons in this context briefly, a couple of remarks specifically on pedagogical collaboration, and then a few remarks on the school itself. In the current context, I believe we should first of all reaffirm efforts to struggle against privatization, inculcate forms of democratic collectivity, and explore autonomous pedagogical projects, which have all been key emphases in scholarship on the commons in education. Under long-standing austerity regimes, public education continues to weaken from lack of funding, control of teaching and curriculum, and now emerging forms of right-wing censorship and regulation. The convivial spaces that Commoning projects have aimed to make available to students confront an educational environment pervasively defined by cutthroat competition and anxiety as students fight for qualifications. Young people are brave and creative, but they face a form of schooling that constitutes at best a training in self-auditing and relentless accumulation of symbolic capital, whatever the cost. At worst, for those unable to pay this cost, school becomes a training in self-blame and demoralization. In these conditions, experiments in collaboration, civic capacity building, and critical consciousness raising are as urgent as ever. Nevertheless, I believe we must think more deeply about the nature of the enclosures that an educational commons would refuse, and also about starting points for resistance. We need to consider the extent to which capitalism organizes not just the marketization of education, but also the discursive terrain for notions of democratic engagement that seek to contest it. Neoliberalism, in particular, aggressively co-opts ideas of empowerment and cooperation in order to turn them into another form of workplace training, particularly associated with so-called 21st century learning. Beyond this, we need to recognize the extent to which basic ideas of collaboration and agency are also organized by a capitalist imaginary oriented not only to the market, but to the basic figures of accumulation and appropriation. So to what extent, for instance, is the idea of student empowerment that we're familiar with in progressive education tied to a notion of power as proprietary, something that I own, my capital, right? Even if it's a different kind of capital. So we're bound up even in our oppositional thinking in these basic paradigms. In addition, decolonial scholars like Sandy Grande and others have pointed out that ostensibly progressive notions of democracy have historically grounded projects of invasion. For indigenous peoples in particular, globally, even being included, which is of course a powerful and necessary figure in many instances, has in historical terms often been a key rationale for assimilation, in the name of which communities have been stripped of land and identity. Even radical democratic projects sometimes repeat this erasure. For instance, the idea of occupation, which was central to the Occupy Wall Street movement and other similar movements globally, including many in Europe, was often used by participants without consideration of the way it discursively repeated the appropriation of indigenous land. As we work to foreground what is shared instead of what is private and proprietary, we need to be attentive to these histories and careful about the cultural and epistemological ground of the collaborations we propose. This is a challenge, but also an opportunity, since we might then come to more powerful models for solidarity, which start from diverse traditions. So, I believe we can insist on radical democratic projects of commoning while also rethinking them. The central proposition I want to put forward here is that the project of imagining and building educational commons might start from the outside, the overlooked, the marginalized, the unqualified. This is an ethical and epistemological imperative, I believe. Philosopher Enrique Dussel argues that an authentically democratic politics must start from a recognition of the dignity of the excluded and the oppressed, which is also to place ethics at the center of politics. In education, I think this means recognizing that schools have not only been undemocratic in their practices many times, but even sites of injury for many communities. In addition, if capitalism has already organized the very space and tools for dialogue and investigation in education, then in the first instance, it's necessary to begin outside the circle of sanctioned knowledge. That is, in heterodox, subaltern, and refused communities and knowledge traditions. For one thing, we need to recognize the educational validity of sites outside of school, not just familiar community projects, but also the invisible edges of daily life, including the hidden spaces that young people make their own through communication and cultural production. This is to inquire into an outside of familiar curriculum, which can furnish forms and ideas for teaching and learning. Not an absolute beyond or a magical space, but rather a real space of resistant life that offers resources and directions for articulating a new commons. In contrast to the idea of exodus, in which we finally leave behind the constituted and familiar, which is central to Hart and Negri's notion of the commons, who have been very influential thinkers in this area, and which we see in a different way in the work of Illich, I want to start from the decolonial figures of delinking and decentering, as described by Walter Mignolo and others. In delinking, we initially separate from dominant systems, but we do not necessarily seek to totally escape from or renounce all dialogue with them. Neoliberalism, after all, is quite content with exodus, since neoliberal education aims to abandon students and families to the wilderness of choice and responsibility. This system is more threatened, I believe, by a decentering that asserts the validity of other ways of being and knowing alongside the dominant. Since at every level, neoliberalism asserts itself as the only possible reality. I am interested in alternative spaces and practices that are in communication with the school, not as mere supplements, but as forces that impinge upon and reframe it, that force it to recognize itself as just one node in a network of learning. For instance, indigenous communities globally have recently invigorated autonomous and traditional forms of teaching while also calling upon schools and universities to respond to their claims on both land and knowledge, resulting, for example, in creative partnerships between researchers and communities. Another way to approach this idea is to consider the commons in terms of the epistemological terrain of education. While democratic projects in teaching have been interested in cultivating critical thinking in students and recognizing differences of perspective that work through any community, they haven't always been attentive to fundamental differences in the meaning and organization of knowledge. In this regard, the kind of solidarity we seek to build in education should be deepened. The notion of pluriversality from Mignolo is helpful here. And this is a term that refers to many different epistemological worlds, many different knowledge traditions and sciences in dialogue with each other, creating a multidimensional knowledge space. Students come from diverse knowledge traditions. A pluriversal teaching would be interested in that diversity as a starting point from which to forge complex dialogue, not just across different perspectives, but also across different frameworks for understanding. In more concrete terms, students come with different stories and with different ways of telling those stories. A project for an epistemological commons in education would be interested in those differences and in the potential combinations between them. In short, how might we support students in finding a sophisticated view of the world, but also, more fundamentally, a multidimensional space and process for understanding itself? It's in this context that we should understand recent right-wing efforts to control curriculum. In the United States in particular, multiple efforts in various states seek to restrict or curtail teaching about racism, gender, and oppression generally. Interestingly, many of these efforts are preoccupied with the teaching of history and aim to present the country from its origins in terms of innocence and triumphalism. This is an ideological offensive and an epistemological one as well, since it asserts a linearity to history as the anchor for its political claims. Critical teaching is dangerous from this perspective because it starts from a different narrativity It's not surprising that these efforts also seek to reinstall central values of competition and entrepreneurialism. This shows that these initiatives on the cultural front are continuous with neoliberalism's reframing of education in terms of the market. Teaching oriented toward the commons, in the eyes of power, is nothing less than a scandal, since it challenges the partitions the system sets up between individual students and different ways of knowing. In my classes, I aim to support students in learning from each other's stories and subjectivities to build an uneven commons of experience and insight. In seeking to shut down this kind of learning, legislators seek to install nothing less than an epistemological governance of the collective intellect. Okay, those are some remarks on the commons generally. A few remarks on collaboration specifically, briefly in the pedagogical context. If notions of decentering and delinking suggest ways for us to seek a more profound commoning at the level of knowledge, there is another decentering at the level of collaboration that is important. A movement from the centered subject of both student and teacher to the revolutionary subject of the group. Here we can learn from the shift in recent social movements away from the fetishism of the singular leader, but also from older insights on the left into the wisdom of the collective. Collaboration in the critical traditions is different from the group work that is recommended in conventional approaches to teaching. In the former, learning aims at transformation. In the latter, collaboration is an alternative mode for experiencing the familiar educational environment and epistemology. For Paulo Freire, collaboration is necessary because we become ourselves through dialogue, and because dialogue is necessary for constructing agency. In a liberal frame, collaboration is teamwork, an appropriation of creative possibilities of cooperation. But even critical approaches can sometimes risk preserving an emphasis on the individual, even if individual subjectivity is activated by means of dialogue with others. The excitement of critical education, as Freire describes it, is in the way that it illuminates a particular learner's relation to the world. Is it possible to look beyond this sense of collaboration to a different and deeper kind of collectivity in education and praxis? Can we think of collaboration not so much in moral or narrowly political terms, but rather in an ontological frame? In doing so, perhaps we can rescue a revolutionary sense for collaboration, one that aims at a material disruption of the given and its discursive police, as Rancière puts it, rather than an enlargement of the subject. One first step in this reconceptualization of collaboration would be to recognize the collective intelligence of people before the formal process of dialogue. C.L.R. James argues that regular people are the actual directors of revolutionary movements, whose implicit or explicit direction more visible and celebrated leaders are faithful to. The task of the leader is not to show people the way, but rather to listen to them in order to discover the way and to help them in the blazing of that trail. This collective understanding is historical, the product of a deep attunement that can only be possessed by an entire social class. Any project for social transformation has to begin from the understandings that are created in the context of crisis and which proceed from the ground up, even where the ground is shifting or broken. Formal pedagogical collaboration as a second order has to be based on this primary collaboration within social being itself, expressed in the elemental intelligence of the mass of regular people. Starting from this understanding in education would mean listening to the collective intelligence of students and recognizing regular people generally as competent students of their own lives. And it's surprising how rarely we do that, right? How unusual it is to grant authority to regular folks for the truths they have, that they come to from their own experience in their own lives. Instead of just building from prior knowledge, as progressive education aims to do, we might aim for unprecedented juxtapositions of experience and understanding. For instance, what indispensable insights on contemporary politics and society do children possess? Do we ask them? What wisdom exists in the communication between the diverse texts that populate formal and informal educational experiences? What secrets about the world do teachers know that they aren't telling because they believe they don't count against the school's official knowledge? Capitalism seeks to abolish intelligence, the collective intelligence of being that listens to and converses with the world. It bends understanding into the distorted forms that are compatible with its distortions of work, relationships, and identity. Collaboration that starts from genuine curiosity has to be directed against these distortions, which limit the possibilities for knowledge, and subversive in reaching past the individualism that is the ideological anchor of capitalist society, in order to crystallize the general intelligence of ordinary people as a powerful subject of learning. So this idea of the commons proposes a distinct form of collaboration. We know that we're not, as teachers, students, friends in any simple way, right? There are differences in power and status that are real and that must be respected and acknowledged, and that in any event we leverage as teachers, right? We make use of that. However, in a deeper sense, I believe, as educators, we should be comrades alongside students, and that we should share in an impulse toward and a love for a project that is larger than ourselves. The commons as an idea puts the center of gravity of collaboration in that shared project rather than in the participants by themselves. While critical pedagogy already emphasizes the importance of communion between teachers and students, collaboration under the sign of the commons evokes a special vulnerability, I believe, for the teacher. This is both personal, the willingness to be known by students, which can be uncomfortable, and curricular, the willingness to release one's privileged grip on meaning. And just to give a personal example of this, as a critical educator, I often think of what I'm teaching students I think about it in terms of a confrontation with the world, with history, with unfolding public events. Very often my students redirect our discussions back to our institution, to the institution itself, to our classroom, to our own selves and subjectivities, and it's always helpful and instructive, right? So beyond the merely critical, the educational commons evokes a learning community that has its own agency and purposes beyond the goals of the teacher. In critical education, we're concerned about the harms that result from the teacher's uninterrogated authority, which becomes authoritarian when it's not interested in its own limits and how it can learn from students. We think of authoritarianism as the means for inculcating submission and as guarantee of the dominant ideology. But perhaps the installation of the teacher-centered organization of the classroom is itself the goal of mainstream education. It unfolds fully in its crystallization of that center, in its accomplishment of the teacher being. The teacher wants to give the students the materials that will lead to the lesson's decided truth. Even critical education, while it refuses to fully articulate that truth, nevertheless wants to get students over to the right region where they can then begin to make their own way. But maybe truth is a field or plane that we are already in, that is already rich in its offerings, and what we need to do is to get to know its complex and particular topography. The point, I think, is that the truth is on the outside. The point is not to bring it in, but to go to it. Our familiar model for emancipatory education is to bring the excluded in, to create a passage to empowerment and integration for the marginalized. But doesn't that movement insist still on the centrality of the center and the wholeness elaborated around it? Better to understand the center itself as partial. You can learn something out there in those disqualified spaces, uncertified, uncertain in their offerings. Furthermore, the official learning, its archives and its offices, have their unacknowledged roots precisely out there beyond the castle walls. All right. I'm going to move now to a few remarks then on the school itself, continuing this line of argument. This is my third piece. So, what are the implications of these observations for the school itself? In light of this rethinking of the commons in epistemological and pedagogical terms, I suggest that we might reimagine the space of school itself as the nexus of diverse collaborations. What if students or parents could propose educational projects reaching across classrooms and generations and professional status? What if the physical space of school were the repository of the artifacts of the imagination of connected communities? What if the school was relevant not only culturally? There's much discussion in the United States about culturally relevant teaching. All colleges of education now, that's standard, right? But what if the school is relevant not only culturally, but also politically, philosophically, strategically? In the US, the public system increasingly serves students of color and poor students as white and more affluent families exit the system for private education. What if the students left behind, together with teachers, seized this space as a laboratory for the creative, complex, and unpredictable production of an organic class consciousness? This is an inherently contradictory proposition to the extent that schools have usually worked to stratify and exclude. Such a school is only imaginable as the result of a purposeful appropriation. As I have argued with Alex Armanda and Adam Martinez, in accordance with the principles of a decolonizing praxis, the institution that has been known as school ought to be recomposed by the knowledges and desires of the community. In this context, a reimagined democratic education must be prepared to acknowledge and build from the sacred spaces and values of different constituencies, not to take and exploit them, but rather to allow them to impinge on and reformulate the meaning and practice of teaching. Democracy here does not mean equal access to a set of sanctioned experiences, but rather an epistemologically diverse opening that allows for different knowledges to confront each other and shape learning. These knowledges live in real places, and so the literal space of schooling could be rethought in this light. The chain of meaning that ties students through curriculum to the order of capital is mirrored, I believe, in the channels and compartments of the school building itself, with its through lines, vortexes, and complex systems of reference and referral. For instance, from classroom to counseling office to detention center. By contrast, we might imagine a school composed of a network of sites, including homes, neighborhoods, community centers, and even ephemeral spaces of youth collaboration or creativity. Learning would take place across these networked sites and in the movement between them. The old site of formal schooling would remain, not as the center of education, but rather as one point in a fabric of educational spaces, and newly humble in its awareness of itself as the location of just one kind of knowledge in communication with others. Again, that's the model I'm interested in, is not complete departure, complete refusal, but rather, what if we put this alongside this? Is the center capable of dialogue and engagement with something other than itself? In some ways, that's a more profound challenge. This proposal starts from a different notion of democracy than that of the progressive tradition, for which the traditional school serves as the center of learning and as a space of integration of students into the shared ethos of the modern. The notion of the democratic school I describe here, by contrast, evokes a process of peripatetic learning and translation of meanings across different frameworks. For example, community knowledges, popular cultural forms, and text-based sciences. This also means a distribution of pedagogical authority, not only among different people, but also different and even non-human agents. For instance, city as teacher, street corner as teacher, wildflower as teacher. Challenging the logic of center and periphery that Dussel identifies as the architecture of coloniality, this school would bring the exterior into the interior and draw the interior into the outskirts, creating a new and impossible topology. Isn't what we confront currently in different global instances precisely a crisis of the logic of center and periphery, in which the inside, in geopolitical, cultural, and curricular terms, clings desperately to its status as center, terrified even of being addressed and engaged by the margins? This post-capitalist school would embrace diverse modes of affect and embodiment as modes of learning in addition to narrowly cognitive ones. Schooling for the commons must be thoughtful about the ways of being it makes possible. In this context, new tones of disposition, relationship, emotion, and identity might enter into the occasion of schooling through the assemblage of actors and experiences informing it. Beyond the poverty of the current neoliberal era, this school would participate in a larger social shift away from scarcity and isolation toward a condition of plenitude and articulation. In contrast to liberal approaches which simply admonish students to avoid being overly competitive, the education that I describe here would begin beyond competition, in a thick juxtaposition of experiences irreducible to the quantification that grounds the zero-sum logic of mainstream schooling. I argue that a pluriversal and distributed education of this kind, working through modes of being beyond the strictly cognitive, would be more rigorous rather than less. And also that there is a kind of rigor that proceeds from joy rather than submission. So, the commons then, as lived within this reformulation of schooling, would have several important characteristics, to draw out a few implications here. So, first, it would be complex, bringing different spaces, modes of learning, knowledges, and subjects together in an assemblage that provokes communication across radical difference. Second, it would be decolonial, determined against the Western privileging of the center and the given. This does not mean instituting a new authority, but rather multiplying relationships. Third, it would be heterodox, framed by non-dominant and non-capitalist rationalities. This characteristic is connected to a certain risk, since the current system determines what practices are intelligible, and it is challenging to step beyond those limits. Finally, and paradoxically, it would be traditional, where this term refers not to dominant norms, but rather to subaltern practices and understandings, many of which are in fact ancient and embedded rather than simply alternative. This is the case with the cultural survival strategies of many oppressed groups which have evolved over time and encode indispensable knowledges. I don't believe that we yet have fully realized examples of this commons. How could we, in a world organized by systems of domination and exploitation? However, we do already have practices that evoke broader possibilities. For instance, projects in schools to take students into the neighborhood to make contact with elders and to learn from the knowledge of communities around the school. Youth-led organizing efforts in which young people educate themselves about issues deeply touching them beyond the space of the school. ethnic studies initiatives which seek to challenge the curriculum with the histories and cultures of non-dominant groups, in this way troubling the center with that which has been marginalized. Radical restorative justice projects which start from healing circles to rethink discipline in the school and distribute administrative authority among participants, and also, and not least, teacher labor strikes, which both assert the humanity and power of teachers against their reduction to functionaries, and which also require deep collaboration with parents and students in order to garner community support and advance the interests of all. These are incomplete in themselves, but these initiatives point to possibilities beyond the given, places that we can only find ephemerally for the time being, but which in being strengthened and linked together may begin to articulate the shape of a new educational commons. We ought to begin to knit these partial moments into a broader tissue of education and to uncover what underlying impulses work across them and what basic principles are precipitated by them. To conclude, capitalism is broken and bleeding, tearing at the earth itself in its developing crises. The capitalist school is in tatters, torn between the irrationality of neoliberal hyper-accountability and right-wing ideological offensives on the one hand, and on the other, the emancipatory impulses implicit in the collaboration between human beings that schooling sets in motion in spite of itself. At the same time, we are in the midst of an essential transition to what Mignolo calls a third nomos for global society, beyond the rule of Western knowing and being. In this context, the Commons is a powerful figure for alternative educational communities, not just an idea, but a historical reality continually reinvented at different times and places. But confronting new challenges as well as new critiques, political and epistemological, the Commons should be rethought, I believe, as I have tried to describe here. This is an important opportunity, actually, since it is the occasion for proposing a more complex model of collaboration, a more potent agency for young people and communities, and the possibility of learning from sites and subjects that have previously been excluded. As educators, we are crucial participants in the global transition this rethinking is connected to. Hopefully, my reflections here can be helpful in these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noah. Should we take 10 minutes for questions or gather everything at the end? How do you feel? At the end, okay. Given that we have only 2 speakers, let's go on and then we can open up the discussion, okay? So keep your questions, reflections or thoughts and let's go on.
Well, hi everyone. Pleasure to be here. It's an honor. So thank you very much for the invitation, Yanis and the team, and Monica for the connection. Well, actually, you don't know yet, but you are my therapy group, because I'm here to show to you all my doubts. So my name is Jordi, and I have a lot of doubts that I will share with you, so then we can contrast together. So I'm sorry about that, but I came from Barcelona just to show with you my doubts, because I have a lot of anxious about that. And these are my anxious debates that I have with myself and my colleagues. The first one related to as Yanni said at the very beginning and Noah exposed as well, if the commons approach fits in education or not. Always when we, the teachers, we put or not at the end, it's like a little bit frightening, like, oh, let's see. The second one is about to discuss a little bit with the Marxist colleagues about the neoliberal reality, but as well with the neoconservative one, that I guess in Europe is having a big wave and is hitting our lives and our educations. The third one is probably the most tricky one. It's about if a school itself is an enclosure or it's a common, and the question if it could be a common or not, so let's debate about that. And future lines of policy research and action about educational commons that I think it could be interesting to keep discussing. So about the commons approach, I'm sure that most of you, or almost all of you, know about that, so I'm not going to be really, I'm going not to spend a lot of time there. But you know that Elinor Ostrom, she was the Nobel Prize on Economy. She published this book about governing the commons. Really interesting, really powerful. She and her wife, they spent her entire life collecting good examples of self-governing the commons around the world. And it's interesting because this approach is like a good tool to do what we could call an ontology of the present. So questioning what we do and who we are as educational and as teachers and non-formal educations, etc. And for sure, the deep critique to modernity and neoliberalism about its truth, formal government, etc. This is a long list of books and papers that you could read. Yeah, there are some of them. I can send you through the organization the PowerPoint, and you can use it. But some of them are really interesting. But for sure, the commons approach is really interesting to question, but it's really interesting to propose. And this is another really interesting about the new truths, what about Noah was talking about, the form of government and identities. And I guess this is really interesting, which are our norms, our rules, our habits, and which norms, rules, and habits are we socializing and teaching to the children and young people. There's a lot of books and papers there, interesting. Starting by the UNESCO, it was really interesting, this report in 2015 questioning that we should move this one. David Bolbier, and we have done some work on that, Yanis as well, etc. These are some books that can be interesting if you are interested in reading. Probably some of them are translated to Greek, maybe others not. And these two are really interesting, especially this one about rethinking education from the UNESCO report 2015. The 2021, this is the big report, about reimagining our futures, and many others that are really interesting. I enjoyed. Okay, following this in other authors, we can summarize the commons approach in these three axes. First, the common good. Yeah? Something that is not enclosure, and that at the Smooth project exposes the very practice of education and learning could become a common good or resource. So the first thing that we need to talk about the commons is something that is in common, That's a common good. The second one is that the common as adjective. So this is first as noun, as adjective, and then as verb. The idea of there is a norms, a relations, a community of commoners, of owners that self-govern this common good, So the Smooth defines us very well this idea of educational commons as learning community where decisions about the educational process are made collectively. Noah was talking about just a minute ago. It's really important, this idea of the collective, because sometimes in our schools it's one leader or the curriculum is done by a small number of university professors or whatever. And the third one is commoning as verb. This idea of social practices in common that explore alternative ways of owning, producing, managing, organizing. And this is very important for me. This idea that commoning can produce alternatives, identities, norms, practices, all that stuff, So this is against this idea of individualization and instrumentalism of the other. And the Smooth exposes that the implication of the commons for refiguring education, etc. These implications, for me, the most important one is that we are producing the people of the future. So we are producing us as subjects. So which are my values, my practices, my habits? Okay, from this perspective, the first debate I would like to share with you, because if I share with you, I feel less anxious, is does the commons approach fit in education or not? You know, what are we doing? It makes sense, a little bit, a lot. I think it's easier to think about the internet or the forest as a common good. When you read the history of the commons, it's quite easy there. Yanis started with this statement at the beginning of the session, and it's true. It's much easier to think about like the fish or the river or the forest, that's something in together that we govern. But what about education? Are our institutions, schools, associations, projects, something that is held in common, that is governed collectively, and is able to produce alternative subjectivities? Could our institution and projects success in this common proof, or maybe not? So this is for me, it's a quite interesting question. So, because before modernity, maybe schools were something like that, you know, something held in common for the community, paid in common, and governed by the open council, you know, because here in Greece, like in Spain and France and the whole Europe, for 1,000 years, from the 5th century until the 15th or 17th century, there were a lot of things in common. And schools, do you know how schools look like approximately before modernity? Like that. There were cows, indeed. Probably self-governing common. So the houses of the hamlet, the houses of the village, they pay for it. For one teacher, that comes from some time. Children go there for a while, then come back home, then go for working in another house, you know? Things were like that. Schools, education was in common. But then arrived modernity and enclosed the community schools and do it to the state. So in history, I'm really sorry about that, to share it with you, bad news. Schools, from our perspective, from my perspective, are enclosures. So it's not that easy to transform it in commons. Yeah? And then they become like that. I love this picture of the leaf. It's like, oh, come on, cut my veins. If this is education, you know. And it's something like that. It looks like this in our schools. Now we do it with ChatGPT, but something like that. So, first debates I would like to share with you. All public education must be state-instituted or governed? Are there other ways to be public than the state? Can exist public education beyond the state? Under which conditions? Are educational commons something public? In this idea of the open, inclusive public interest, or have a different nature? Could educational commons be public, of public interest, even if they belong to a cooperative, a foundation, a club, an association? Under which conditions? More debates. Are schools today a common resource oriented from and for the common good? Is it, can it fit with this idea of being in a state or private institution? And what about non-formal, that Yanis has started as well with this idea of non-formal and informal education? Could then become an educational common? Could a sports club, extracurricular activities, drama, art, and music become a common? Yes, no? Under which conditions? And maybe some of you were in the Palermo Smooth conference some weeks ago in April. And there, Christian Laval, he proposed this idea that education as common is equal to the collective right to education. So commons is against privatization. Do you agree with that, or is something else? the first step about my own doubts. The second one is about neoliberal and neoconservative education, if the commons can fight against these two logics. From the Marxist perspective, the commons approach is mainly related to the analysis against the market enclosures. And here, for sure, Noah is one of the pioneers with his colleagues Means and Salman and Ford and Slater, and I totally agree with them. But this but is when your mother, you say la la la, and your mother say but. It's like, oh Jesus Christ, but. During the 18th century, for example, in Spain, it was the modern state who forced all the commons to be or state or private. So the state has the main role in Europe to enclose the lands, the rivers, the forests, etc. Was the state who forced it. For example, in the Pyrenees, they forced to privatize 12 million hectares of land. It was the state that said, or private or state. You cannot be common, So all goods had to be or private or property. Nothing could left as common, this idea of the res communis. Nothing could left that, This is really interesting book, the Carl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. He explains very well how the state forced forced communities to sell or to statize or to nationalize all the resources they had. And from this they start the urbanization, industrialization, individualization, etc. So, I feel very comfortable with this idea that commons approach is against neoliberal logics. Yes, I totally agree. But what about the state? What about neoconservatorism? What about bureaucracy? Bureaucracy, oh, wow. What a lovely word, full of paperwork, a lot of things to do. What 10 years ago you did one click, now you need one afternoon spending fulfilling applications, submissions, reports. It's another way of enclosure. Homogenization, disciplinarization. I do some research with my colleagues in England. They start 10 years ago a new discipline rooms in state schools where they put children with bad behavior or maybe that they have a wrong position of the tie or the skirt is too short, So they go for 2 hours, this disciplinary room that is coached because you cannot hurt yourself. This is happening today in England, in state schools. What about neoliberalism there? No, it's about, the state, the neoconservadorism. And I guess the commons is a good tool to question. Or the recentralization, this idea of a state curriculums, everybody has to do the same at the same time. Do you remember this statement of Jules Ferry, the French Minister of Education, mid-19th century, when he said, if today is Friday at 10 o'clock, all children in France, they are doing French or they are doing maths because everybody do the same at the same time, So are there new forms of enclosures or not? So more debates. Is educational commons a perspective and a praxis only against the market and private enclosures? Or it has to question the neoconservative forms related to all that stuff? And what about the non-formal education? Again, related to a sports club, association, cooperatives, could they be part of the educational commons? How and under which material, government, democratic orientation circumstances? Even more, what about informal education? What about what we do in families that is the most important education? What about the internet? What about these devices so powerful that we put in our teenagers' hands? Is this a common? Is this enclosure? Could they be part of the educational commons? How and under which circumstances? The third debate about school as enclosure or as a commons. With Stephen Bull from Institute of Education, during the pandemic, we were really bored, and we started writing this paper. We did 20 versions. It was a nightmare, not a paper. And at the end, we question this idea that maybe schools in itself, as a tool, not related to the teacher, not related to the children, not related to the families, for sure, related to the tool, this deep grammar of the school, 1 hour, one teacher, one group, one subject, you know, this deep grammar. Maybe it's a tool, it's a problem itself. And why maybe it's an enclosure, it's a problem in itself? Well, because more bad news. When the states create the mass modern schools in the 18th century in the whole Europe, they didn't do it for equality, for well-being, or for learning for all. Even the French revolutionaries, they write that the school was for inequality, for maintaining the status quo, for not changing anything. So the first debate is that the schools were created for competition, for moral managing, etc. So it's a problem. Sometimes we feel that the schools are not a really interesting tool, that sometimes we have problem with these logics. It's because it was created against equality, not for equality. The second one, a school teaches universal thoughts, this idea of a system of division and classification that we establish about normal and abnormal. From modernity, everything, every person, every is in this bell curve, and you belong to the normality or you are not normal. And a school is a place where all the time we're discussing this learning is not normal this year. These marks are not normal, you know? High capacities, low capacities, everybody is classified according to this idea. The third one is about this idea of normalize one way of being. You know, the school teaches that there are one normal people and the others. And who is normal people? Me. White, man, middle class, university degree, blah, 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 blah. And the others. It's what Noah was talking about as well. And for sure, this is about a privilege or exclusion or inclusion. A school is a place where inequalities are verified, not reduced. Jacques Rancière put this terrible statement, but again, it's true. We are all the time saying, this student a little bit lost, low level, the levels are going down. You know, before it was hard working, all this stuff, you know. Schools as a site for discretion of groups, calculation, and the treatment. Always in the schools and in the rest of education, they have the problem. Some of them, they have to have a pathology, they have a problem, and they have to be solved. They have a problem, never the school, never the education system, never the sports club. They have the problem. These beautiful books, the school or this one about hard to reach parents. I love this paper. You know, these parents, I haven't done a lot of research about family, school, and community relationships. And all the schools in Spain, all of them, when I go there to work with them, they start to say, parents, they are a problem for us. Jesus Christ, a problem. You know, they are if they don't have children, you don't have the school. They are not a problem. And a school is about individualization. This idea of separateness, you know? This idea that we are aware, we are separate one each other. Some books related to the Elizabeth Berkhan, Ulrich Beck, or Bauman, or Norbert Elias. Beautiful classic there. And modern smart school is about the enclosure and the monopoly of legitimate knowledge. It's what Noah was talking before. This idea that what we teach into the school is a real, important, and good knowledge. And when you learn outside, more or less, but not, for sure. It's not the same level, you know. What we teach inside the school is a real good knowledge, official knowledge, you know. So what they teach families or community, because schools were created in the 18th century against families and against community. We are going to put children inside these institutions. We're going to put the specialists on children because families and community, they educate really bad. So we're going to do good inside, bad outside. Some books from Carol Vincent, and this really interesting book that is related to what Noah was talking before about colonialism, from Arati, Sophie, and Jessica. Arati was in Cambridge while I was there. It's really interesting, this idea of how schools is one of the main tools for this colonization, especially they are talking about Australia. And one of the things that shocked me more and make me more anxious last years is how people from the ecological research that they don't know nothing about education are pointing us, educators, in all respects as one of the main problems of the ecological crisis. And they say, we have to consider if education is in fact a solution or a cause of the trouble now we face. It is clear that the earth does not need more educated consumers of knowledge. Woo! Exactly, yeah. They are calling us, to question what we are doing. Instead, we must first fundamentally change not what we know, but that ways of being. Again, identity, subjectivities, what kind of people we are producing in schools, in sports, extracurricular activities, in families, in community projects, in libraries, in museums, what kinds of ways of being, not knowledge. In Barcelona, we did a research about people and all this idea of recycling and all that stuff. Young people, they have all knowledge. Recycling, reducing, all that stuff. Practices of recycling, nothing. Old women, they don't know nothing about all that stuff, but they do all the practices. They recycle, they do, It's not about the knowledge. It's about the ways of being, who I am. And sometimes maybe you have to refuse who we are. Because who we are is related to the climate change, the climate crisis, about segregation, all that stuff. So, more debates, and I'm going to finish. This idea, can schools become an educational commons to create democratic and inclusive education? If yes, how and under which condition? I guess that we have to question schools and itself if we want to transform it in an inclusive and educational commons. Can schools produce common dynamics in different subject identities? So, with the same tool that are modern schools, modern mass schools, can we produce alternative identities, alternative ways of being? Not. Are part of the solution of the problem, as Komatsu Bradley explained. And another important one, especially related to university. I think that sometimes our research, our concepts, our categories, our methodologies are part of the machinery that reconstructs enclosures. So, are we using absolutely unintendedly, for sure, we have a really good will, but could it be possible that without knowing, our approaches, our concepts, our methods, they could contribute and perpetuate enclosures and segregations? Could our research, categories and results and how to explain it to the world be part of the problem? Is it possible to co-create different scientific approaches, concepts as methods to be that our research can be considered as well as an educational commons? How and under which circumstances? And here in this paper just published 2 months ago, part of an special issue about new sociological imagination, I used the common societies in the Pyrenees in Spain and feminist, the ancient matriarchats, as a mirror, as a critical mirror to question our practices, our social sciences, as sociologists. Just in case you are interested, or just in case you have problems to sleep. So it could be a really good tool about that. And just future lines of policy research. I totally agree with Yanis, with Noah, that the educational commons approach is a very powerful and promising perspective in education. And I reckon that we have to address different scientific questioning, educational debates and policy dilemmas in order to become a real and available and open alternative. and to co-create new realities. So I guess this is a really interesting project you are in, a really powerful tool, a really powerful approach, but I have some questions about that. Both dimensions, the critical one and the constructive creative one, can be really powerful tools. As we have tried to explain in this second paper on this series of 4 that we are writing with Stephen, the third one will be a little more concrete, just in case we're interested. So, some dilemmas, some debates about that. First one, I guess that we have to be really aware of questioning past, present, and future enclosures in education. I guess this is really important. And I guess, for example, the NOAA speech was about that, to be aware of what's happening before and now, and how this geography of the enclosures are changing, and how have to be aware of what's happening there. The second one is about to self-interrogate ourselves as sociologists, educators, about our perspectives and this idea of the common proof, you know? In some countries, they started this idea of the rural proof. So they read all the laws just to be aware of, if some of them, they are being against the rural wall and the rural development, etc. So maybe we need like a commons proof, you know? So this idea of co-create different research, different orientations. For example, some examples that you know better than me, this idea of the common research, popular university, citizen science, co-construction of knowledge. So I guess it's important that we as researchers, that we produce concepts, research approaches, we have to be self-aware that maybe we are not all the time improving or boosting the commons approach. The third one, how to co-construct open models of educational policy. How and under which conditions. So informal, non-formal, informal education. How all these spaces can be created or transformed into educational commons. How, when, under which conditions, you know? Which model can we follow? Open models, for sure, not like there is only one path, but as Noah said before, we need to learn more about experiences like Elinor Ostrom did around the world to learn how to do it. And for sure, addressing formal debates about who is governing this education, what times and spaces we are using in this education project or institution. Educators, parents, and children and young people are commoners or not. What identity are we building up or not? And substantive debates about how education commons is related to inclusion, to participatory and democratic relations, to equity, creativity, decolonial, feminist, etc. The fourth one is, as I said before, learn from each other. And I guess it's really important, and I guess this is one of the most powerful things of the SMOOTH project, these many different experiences, and how to create contextually conditions of possibility to create or transform all educations into educational commons. How to do it? Which patterns, some advices, some open patterns about that. The last one is, just in case we keep being disappointed about the schools, maybe one day we should need an alternative, you know, to educate. Because maybe in 10 years or 20 years, we can be aware that it doesn't work at all. And maybe we need a B plan, so how can we do it? And for sure, many other proposals I will learn from you all. So here you are my email, and ResearchGate, you can find some of these things if you can use it openly. And thank you very much. Evgaristo.
Thanks a lot, Jordi. So I would like, first of all, to thank our keynote speakers for respecting our key time here, because I've been in some cases, you know, that we speak about commons and we forget to respect our the time of the rest of the speakers, etc., etc. So thanks a lot. And then on this concept of center and periphery, and on the point of view of having keynote speakers and discussing all these radical thoughts, I would say to take the keys from the keynote speakers, and so we can have keynote speakers and unlock note audience. So let's unlock the keynote speakers. So we have plenty of time to discuss. I think that there's not much need for me to do a facilitation of the discussion, but if needed, I will jump a little bit into. So we can pass in discussing openly the brainstormed ideas and reflections that we've heard. So let's go on with the mics. Feel free to comment, reflect, question, etc.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I really liked it. I really liked it. And one question that just came up into my mind was that you were talking about educational commons and how to integrate it in schools. So I really like to ask you, did you already try to integrate it in universities, in your own work? Do you already have some experiences with it?
This is a very difficult question to start off. Yeah, I think it's really important to try to, as Noah said before, to try to do yourself what you're trying to explain to others. So, for example, I teach in teachers training, and there is one subject called diversity and inequality, and there more of the half of the school year I do not teach it. We go to different experiences in the territory. So my students, because they put me a strange timetable, like 3.5 hours each week on the line. So from 8:30 until noon in the morning. So I have a lot of time there. So we move from the university and go to the, for example, familiar spaces. They work 0 to 3 years old. Some community projects related to newcomers, etc. So different, and we go there and we stay there for 2-3 hours discussing with people, with the families they go, with children, etc. So we try to do these spaces like they are open, in common, and we try to learn it. So it's not like I have the knowledge, as Noah said before, and I am the one who knows everything, but we go there and I learn a lot from there. So we're trying to do something more horizontal, more in dialogue, and especially trying to create these spaces that we go there and we build up in common. So I try to do it a little bit on that stuff, and I guess it's really important to try to do it from the university as well, because our students, they tend to say that we tend to explain really radical ideas in a really traditional way, and probably something that we have to change a little bit. That.
Does this work? Okay. That's an excellent question, and it sort of gets to the heart of the problem. How do we actually do this? How do we implement this work? And I do many of the things that Jordi was talking about. We work to connect our students to community spaces, to community organizations, to do work beyond even education in different kinds of spaces in the community. And at the undergraduate level and the graduate level, many of our students are actually leaders in many of these organizations. And all of that is very important. Of course, it doesn't overcome many of the challenges that Jordi was talking about. After all, the institution preserves its conventions and norms, and it preserves its power in relationship to the community. So we come up against these problems immediately. I also think we have to think really in terms of the pedagogy itself, the classroom moment, and how do we create a space not just where we're co-constructing the curriculum, say, but where we're building a community together of investigation. And I really try to do this, you know, sometimes more successfully than others with my students, where I try to get away from, nobody here has the answer. Like, don't look at me, don't look at nobody, no one's got the answer. We have a problem. We're gonna have to work together and think through this, and there's no shortcut. And you have the answer, if anybody has the answer, together, right? So I really, it's kind of as an ethic of teaching, to pursue the commons in that way.
Yes, Charlie.
Thank you very much. It is actually, I would say, Jordi, that for me it was therapy. Sometimes you're speaking about so many things and people look at you like, what? Rights to children? You must be like out of focus. So it is actually good to know that we are all in the same package. I wanted to ask if either of you are familiar with the 20% proposal. In the US, it is supported by AERO, the Alternative Education Resource Organization, Jerry Mintz. In Europe, it is supported by the European Democratic Education Community. And it comes from the experience of Google, where they gave 20% of the time to their workers, to their employees, to focus on research projects of their own choice. Our Gmail, the Gmail that we're using on a daily basis, comes from the 20% proposal. And there are some schools which are actually implementing such a practice, giving 20% of the curriculum time, of the timetable to kids to engage in meaningful projects. How do you see this happening within, and I'm pretty familiar, I'm Colombian, but I'm familiar to the Greek educational system. How do you see this happening within a context in which we continue educating for the exams? We put lots of pressures on teachers, on parents, full of fear for the damn future of their children, but also on kids and their mental health. How do you see this shift happening, convincing people in charge also to organize, reorganize both negotiated curriculum and timetable to be able to fit these kind of experiences in which we are common in education, common in schooling, horizontally? Thank you very much.
These 3 or 4 last years, we have been discussing a lot, especially with Stephen, but with many other colleagues, about the school and all that stuff. And for example, we did a collected book about inclusion. And inclusion everywhere in the world, but for example, in Spain, it's really important today. Inclusion in many respects, not only related to special needs, but related to, you know, that trying to build up a school for everybody, where everybody is have a presence, have a participation, and have an achievement. And all the time we are going again to this idea that one of the most important patterns is to this structure, the school structure. So this idea that this one grammar, or the deep grammar of the school, this idea of 1 hour, one subject, one teacher, all the things that you can destructure and you can put together different teachers, different groups, doing different things, mixing subjects, everything that goes against this deep grammar of this one deep grammar of the school, so one subject, one teacher, 1 hour, one group, one age, etc. I guess it's something that can help to produce something in common. Because, you know, it's all the time, because this structure, it's always related, this idea that individualized student that memorize one subject, then repeat one subject to me in the exam, is as closer as he or she repeats the best marks, you know? So everything that helps to question this one is really interesting. And in non-formal education, I guess it's the same. Everything that can help to destructure the times, the spaces, the relations, and work, what Noah said before, this idea of collectively, you know, doing things together, etc., or the same before, I guess is intuitively, intuition is a good, I guess it's interesting to build up or to be closer to educational commons, I guess.
That's a very interesting proposal. And I think that's creative and sorely needed in a context where increasingly, at least in the United States, the space and time of school is totally saturated, right, by the accountability regime in one way or another. So I think that's really interesting and creative. Now, I have to say, though, that I am anxious about those kinds of initiatives just because of the very flexibility of the neoliberal regime that we live within, right? Which is, when it comes from the top down, is expert at absorbing those kinds of initiatives. So, for instance, okay, so students have free time to do their own projects, and then how is that assessed, or how is that governed, or how does that then come to count, right? How does that added to the dossier of the student in one way or another? And those are critical questions too, are they not, right? Because the tendency is, and what we see, of course, is there's the official time where we're getting our good grades, and then there's all the unofficial time where we're accumulating the different kinds of symbolic and cultural capital. We can say, oh, we did all this other stuff too, as students, you know, for instance, to get into university, right? So neoliberalism is very flexible, very devious. It's both privatization, marketization, but it's also bureaucracy. I would say that that's also neoliberalism, right? Working in from both directions. It can structure and also destructure. And so I think a question is, what's going on underneath? What is the ethic? What is the epistemological space here? How is it decided what counts as legitimate knowledge production in those kind of contexts? What shows up as learning? And then we have to get to some of those basic questions. Not easy, but I think it's critical.
And I want to say that I'm really happy to know that Noah is anxious as well.
Very anxious.
This is a question for both of you, and I wish to make you kind of come in a dialogue, as you mentioned, Noah. In your presentation, Noah, you said quite a few things about commons and how we can see them against capitalism, against colonialism. You didn't mention anything about patriarchy. Mm. But I guess in your decolonial project, patriarchy or anti-patriarchal ways might be also an important part. Then in your presentation, we heard a lot about neoliberal and neoconservative practices that influence a lot about and paint what school is today, a very different type of school that produces a certain type of individual with a certain identity. Okay, so that's, for me, brings in mind all this Popkewicz's work about making certain subjects, making certain kinds of people through education and through schooling and all that. So, yeah, it makes me a little bit, on the one hand, peaceful to feel like, okay, yes, this is what it is. But then on the other hand, I still want to have in mind that there are many examples that deviate this making a certain kind of citizens, individuals, or whatever, through school, through education, and blah, blah, blah. In other words, there is always something that does not obey the norms of the one identity that the system strives to produce, like capitalist system or patriarchal system or whatever. So there is always something that escapes, something, you don't want to use the word escape, but maybe there is something there. So I'm wondering how anti-patriarchal ideas play in your decolonial project on the one hand, and then what might be the answers that the feminist, well, no, maybe the old women in Pyrenees who used to have commons and you studied them, what could be the answers that they could offer? Could they be democratic answers? What are the type of commons that they create up there? Are these commons feminist commons? In what ways? How do they speak to the many different anxieties of feminism today? How do they disturb the patriarchal norms and identities? Yeah, so I think, yeah. Sorry about that. If it is too much, but
No.
yeah, I think.
I guess that your question is extremely powerful. And, well, I need 3 or 4 minutes. I'm really sorry about that. In this paper, I learned a lot from that because I used first the ancient matriarchats, for example, in Crete, you know, that some feminists, yeah, for sure. So, and what we have learned from history is something sometimes against intuition, and it's that what happened before modernity was a society with more equality, men, women, much more equality. So, patriarchal structures do not come, probably related to some feminist historians, they do not come from medieval ages, but they come from modernity. So, for example, in Spain, you know this beautiful tradition to burn women related to witcher, etc., was all related to modernity. And the patriarchat is related to modernity. For example, in the common society, during 1,000 years, one person represents each house. And it didn't mind if it was a man or woman. So half of the representatives of the houses in the assembly in the village were women. So that changes in modernity. So what I'm trying to say is that I totally agree with you that it exists, it existed at least some societies where the commons and the non-patriarchal society were together. And I guess we can learn a lot from that, because there were societies more related to goddess than God, more related to cooperation than to competition, etc. Were fantastic, etc. There were no resistances. Yeah, for sure, absolutely. But, so I guess it's a really important question. And I'm sorry because it's a little bit long to explain, but a lot of things that we read from modernity, for example, to medieval ages, we read it wrong because we use our patriarchal lens. And some feminist historians started to question what happened in the Middle Ages is not what we were intended to think about, you know? So I guess it's really interesting, that question. And I guess from my humble point of view, and I tried to do a little bit of research about all that stuff in this paper, we can learn a lot from more communalist societies about that they were more equal in gender balance. So I guess the answer is yes.
Yes, I also want to thank you for the question, such an important question. And indeed, that the notion of patriarchy really should be, I take it as a correction too, should be a little more central to the analysis, and I think that's a good point. I think these things are inseparable. There's, as Jordi was alluding to, there's much interesting work that shows that the oppression of women was essential to the consolidation of capitalism, part of the process of enclosure, Federici's work. In addition, there's very interesting work around coloniality and gender and how colonialism instituted at the same time not just particular modes of economic production, but also gender formations, also racial formations, kinds of being, ways of being, and that these things go together. They work intricately together. Maria Lugones is very important on coloniality of gender. The other side of that is, I think, as many recent feminists have argued, that we have to think about gender in relation to coloniality and capitalism. And then just to take this a step further, I think now we have to speak about heteronormativity, cis heteronormativity, as part of this complex, all right? As part of not just a disciplinary regulation of the subject, but a reinforcement of this mode of production, of being. We have to get to the basic question of ontology, of how and who we can be. And to give a very concrete, because this can get very abstract, to give a very concrete example of this, where I live in the state of Texas, there is currently a very aggressive effort by the state politicians to regulate the curriculum and to remove all the critical teaching and all the teaching about race and all the teaching about LGBTQ people, right? And all of that. And at the same time, in the standards that they want to reinforce, they want to place at the center entrepreneurialism and merit and competition. And for them, all of these things go together, right? They're part of the same project. I think we need to learn something from that, right? That we're dealing with a system with different moments and dimensions, but that they work together, and that we struggle against all those things at once in order to be effective. So I appreciate the observation and the question.
Thank you very much, especially Jordi for the therapy session. I am Yuri Mészáros from Hungary, and a researcher, and I like doubts, and I like the session. But I would like to raise maybe another doubt after your doubts. And as far as I understood, you have offered a critique of schooling, a very strong critique of schooling, a bit similar to the one of Illich, for example. But at the end, you finished your presentation with saying maybe in the future we will see that school won't work and we need alternatives and so on. So my question is, if we accept this, or if we take seriously this strong critique, I have my doubts about this critique, but anyway, if we take that seriously, what is the next step? Isn't it maybe to be more radical, to say that, okay, so if we have this very serious problem with the school, we should go and deconstruct or destruct in a destructive way. I mean, this would be a more radical answer, because sometimes I like doubts, but doubts won't change, so maybe this would be the next step. So what I want to be provocative, I want to offer this kind of provocation to you. And if not, if this is a critique, but maybe we don't dare to go into that direction, to deschooling society, as Illich's project was, what are the other ways, radical ways and ways of acting, ways of doing beyond doubts? I like doubts and we need doubts, but what are the next steps after that, after we doubted? Thank you.
Ulrich Beck, he always proposed to the social scientists to do not put or, but to put and. So I would like to try to answer your question putting an and. I think that we need both things. The point of the part of the first paper with Stephen was that our own disappointment with the schools. For example, in Catalonia, 15 years ago, we had a really strong wave against school segregation. We worked with 6 or 7 cities, we worked with them a lot of time, we improved the segregation level, etc. 5 years later, things were even worse at the very beginning. This feeling that in middle term, 10, 15, 20 years, the school always come back to the riverbed is something that makes me feel anxious. And that is why probably my proposal would be that we need to do both things at the same time. So this one and the other one. The first one is that question about how can we transform our schools, our universities in an educational commons? How, under which circumstances, and which open patterns we should have. And I guess that projects like the Smooth could be really useful because it's a project that comes from the roots. It's a bottom-up project, and I guess that this idea that open patterns that Elinor Ostrom showed in her research, I guess it could be really interesting because I guess that we all need some patterns, some experiences to learn from. So I guess this is the first one. So what can we learn from different experiences in Greece and all over the world, how they do it, how to open it up schools, how to transform or keep transforming or try transforming our institutions, educational institutions, informal and non-formal education to educational commons. First one. And the second one, and as we were discussing with Yanis, Ioannis, and all those people, that in the third paper with Stephen, we're trying to think about how to do it. You know, this idea that could it be possible? So the question is, how could it looks like? Could it looks like an education beyond schools? You know, and we're trying to use this concept of social infrastructures. You know, so I guess that especially last year there have been a lot of literature there. A lot of experiences related to libraries, museums, churches, etc. And probably US, they have a different approach to all that stuff. And probably this idea could be interesting. So trying to, again, to question this deeper structure of the school. So probably I will put an and. So trying to do this one, what you're doing in the Smooth project, that I guess it's really, really worthy. And on the other side, try to think or figure it out at least, how it could be something different, and maybe somewhere, someone dare to try something on that space, and that could be interesting. So just to share a question. Thank you very much.
If I could just say a couple of things. I agree with Jordi's response. And with the point in the presentation, it's not good enough to just say, oh, let's keep the school public and not private. We know historically that the school has operated as a space of enclosure, a space of discipline, a space of oppression. It's not good enough to just keep doing the same thing, right? But let's not romanticize what's outside of the school, because all the same forces are operating in the other spaces of society too, whether that's patriarchy, you know, capitalism, all the rest of it is everywhere, right? So we don't solve the problem by simply going somewhere else, I think. I also think the school is too important of a space to abandon, which is probably why there's so many efforts from certain quarters to weaken the institution. Because in spite of this history, just by the fact of people being together in communication, however distorted, however imperfect, there are possibilities there. There are underground kinds of solidarity. And I believe there's possibility, and in some cases, possibility that is actually enacted in real ways. It can't, it's momentary. The projects, the Smooth project is investigating these possibilities. We have to build on those. I don't think that we can give up on the space of school. We can see, for instance, there's a radical ethnic studies movement in the United States. Projects, some of you may have heard about Tucson, Arizona, Chicano Studies movement. Now it's really taken off. It's really interesting. All over the country there's efforts. And to me, these are really powerful and promising projects because they have shown, research has shown, that when students get a kind of curriculum and teaching they can relate to and that connects to their community, they're more engaged, right? And this curriculum is connecting implicitly inside and outside because connecting the school to the community students come from, Chicano studies, Black studies, and it's also why it's excited a very aggressive counterattack from folks who don't want this. And it's been a long-standing fight in Arizona, but elsewhere too. But to me, it shows that there are possibilities. There are possibilities. I think we have to do two things at once, and we have to work inside and outside. I think one problem is that we often think, oh, how can I transform the school? How can I make that school into something different? As if the school wasn't already connected to all this other stuff. We can't just think about the school by itself. We've got to think about that whole complex. How do we transform that whole complex of relationships from different starting points, I think. And maybe that's not easy, but maybe that's more hopeful ultimately.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting and refreshing and amazing. So I have a question. It will cover both of you, from you, the policy side, from you, the practical side, I guess. So while you're deconstructing with Stephen, you're ultimately reconstructing something else. And the idea of the policy is that we have seen it before, notions, that they are positive notions for critical theorists, become part of the policy. And then the notion changes, and then we have implications in the schools that become measurements. So you have a wonderful notion, commons, and how do you protect this notion from policy by creating new policy using the notion of commons, and etc. That becomes a normality. And then it gets consumed from policy or ideology, if we take it in a more Marxist side. And in the practical side, that's the policy side that I'm concerned, and the practical side, we've seen collaborations before. I'm going to take one of your contexts with Michael Apple and Channel One, and the collaborations between Newport Christians and Marxists for very specific reasons. But those collaborations, they completed the purpose and then they failed. They did not continue. So how, in practical essence, this will actually be a continuous mode when different interests come into play? So that's the question. Thank you.
Jesus. Hopefully she only had 2 questions, because if not... This is a really difficult question, because according to my 25 years experience, each time that you try to translate good concepts, ideas into a policy, lots of problems appears, lots of them. So, I guess that one of the main problems of our educational policy is related to the distance. So this is related to something that I started to saying. For example, this idea of self-government. Most policies, I guess, at least in Europe, they are top-down. So it's something that, for example, in Spain, it's thought, or in Madrid, or at least in Barcelona, and they apply everywhere. So top-down, homogenization, so it's the same for everyone, for every territory. There is no self-government at all. There is no, so I guess the commons approach, it's not only about what, but it's about how. And it's again related to what the colleague questioned before. This idea for me, I am talking more from a Foucauldian approach, and he's talking from a Marxist approach, so there are differences there. And for me, there is no system, no intention. If you put some measures, the result will be this one. But these measures are not intended sometimes. And sometimes the result is on the contrary. So reality is complex, you know. But I guess that, for example, both Elinor Ostrom and both David Bollier and Silfra Helkic, they try to work with this idea of patterns, open patterns. So it's not about doing an enclosed policy and giving to each of you to apply it. You have to apply this, you have to apply it, or you have to apply it. But on the contrary, it's lying to giving. You have to do this process, and I know that each territory will be different. And I guess it's one of the most powerful possibilities of the educational commons. Not working on closed policies, top-down policies, enclosed policies, but working from open patterns that are intended, and the point of self-government is quite important. If community, schools, families, students, young people, they are involved, it's different. That is something that decided 1,000 kilometers ago. They don't know nothing about us. So I guess the how educational commons are proposing the actions could be, I guess, one of the most important tools when we think about to rescale to an educational policy, I guess. But we have to work on it because I guess it's not really well structured yet. But I guess it's really, for me, it's really promising as a list.
So I think policy is essential. But I think that it has to be an expression, a reflection of activity on the ground, and in education in particular, and especially when we're talking about the commons. Doesn't the commons place the emphasis on the self-governing collective in practice, right? And so policy has to proceed from that starting point and as a kind of expression of that activity. And in practical terms, that is very difficult. From a Marxist perspective, yes, there are imperatives. They're not exactly intentions, right? They are systems and interests and imperatives that are at work that make it very difficult for policies to preserve the initial impulses and purposes. I think I have to think of this in terms of the old idea of hegemony and counter-hegemony. We struggle and we get some footholds, and we have to keep struggling to hold on to that space and not to be dislodged from it. But that's very important. There's all related to the notion of the commons. There's all kinds of more basic contradictions between a sort of generality implied in policy and then the particularities of local instances. That's a sort of more basic tension that we have to deal with. But I will say that if we can imagine and then in fact create policy that is genuinely reflective of the commoning projects that folks are involved in, that's very powerful. That's very powerful. And I think we should imagine that and work towards it, but it's a difficult project in the political context that we're in.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both of your presentations. I think this question is more to you, Noah, but feel free, Jordi, to fill in. I'm thinking a lot about asymmetry and symmetry in relation to commons and what we're talking about today. And I kind of struggle with it in relation to my own research as a PhD student. The notion of asymmetry as needed in an educational relationship. You know, you don't know all of the things, and you read something, and you move back, and you know the shaky of getting to know something. So I was wondering, what are your notions, Noah, about asymmetry and symmetry in relation to education commons?
That's a wonderful question. Can I ask if you're thinking about teachers and students in relation or something else?
I'm thinking teachers, students, preschool teachers, children, pedagogue, yeah.
Well, I don't have the answer to that question. I can tell you, nobody does, I think, but I can tell you a kind of place I've come to with that, okay? Which is, I do think there is an asymmetry that is irreducible. I think we deceive ourselves if we say that the teacher is just like the student. It's not true. Institutionally, it's not true. And it may not be, maybe that's not what we need or aim for, right? The teacher does come with kinds of knowledge and experience that are different. And that's important. However, I also think that there is a deep, this is ideological, this is ontological, there are deep habits of authority that are connected to all these systems we've been talking about that infuse us immediately as teachers, right? And through which these systems operate through us, and that we have to be skeptical of that authority in a deep way. And so that's why I'm interested in not so much the teacher just as a facilitator, because there's that kind of model, sort of Deweyan model, we sort of set up the environment, but I'm interested in the teacher as a participant, an active participant, someone sharing their knowledge, someone sharing their expertise, but nevertheless, a participant, maybe a special participant, but someone also affected by what's happening, someone also vulnerable to it, someone who may be led in a direction different from what they anticipated by the conversation as a whole. So I'm still sort of trying to work that out, but that's how, so there is an asymmetry there. But it's a very particular one that involves a deep process of reflection on the part of the educator, a special sensitivity, moment to moment in teaching. That's just how I think about it anyway.
Somebody else?
Yeah, from me as well, thank you very much for the interesting discussion and two presentations. My name is Morgan Etzel, and to add on to the previous discussion, in the other two questions before, I'm curious, there's a lot of discussion about this, a lot of neos up here in the state and things like that, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, etc. And when we're coming down on the commons level, how do we deal with the absence, if there was a restructuring of education? How do we deal with the absence of the symbolic capital of this education degree? How would that be used, or what form would that have? My second concern is related to the decolonial aspect. And there's a lot of discussion about decolonial, but not much discussion about the global South. And that opens up a whole different category and thing and complication. Nonetheless, it gives me a little bit of disconcert when this discussion goes on without at least a consideration for how will the global south be incorporated? Otherwise, we're just again in the global north and privileged people talking about how we're going to decolonize education.
Okay, I'm actually going to take the second question, if that's okay. And maybe I'll leave the first one to Jordi. I really appreciate the observation on the decolonial angle and the importance of the global south. And I want to say a couple of things. One, I hear you, and it's absolutely the case, that the global south needs to be central in these conversations, not just as a place where many of these processes are sort of happening to people, let's say, but as a laboratory for experiments in commoning, for crucial moments of leadership and creativity. So the work in Brazil around the citizenship schools on Porto Alegre that Luis Gangin has investigated, the tremendous history of student movements in Chile, for instance, which have shown a way forward for challenges to neoliberalism, precisely to all these systems that we so frequently point to, and all kinds of experiments in collective resistance. I'm particularly interested in Latin American ones, right? And the Zapatistas in Chiapas remain a singular example for me, both broadly and in terms of education. So I think we have to look to those cases as exemplars for us in thinking about this work. But the other thing I would say, though, is that when we talk about the decolonial, we also are talking about the global north. We have to be able to turn that gaze back on the north and to examine it as an agent not just of policy making, liberal, conservative, but as a colonial agent in the present. And sometimes when we talk about colonialism or coloniality, our conversations are confined to the global south, or people are only referring to other societies and not to the West, not to the United States, for instance, as an ongoing agent of colonial oppression and exploitation. So I appreciate the intervention, and absolutely, I think that discussion has to be a global one.
Sorry, which was the first question?
Just if we're replacing neoliberalism with these concepts in developing commons. Right now, currently education, you have a symbolic capital. Education, what's the goal of education right now? In the neoliberal hierarchy is to produce symbolic capital, a degree, more or less, right? Not to produce good citizens. Is that, this is what I took from the earlier discussion. So what would be the replacement at the commons level of this symbolic capital? What would be the replacement of this degree? What would be the goal? Or would there be a goal?
I haven't thought about that. I'm sorry, but I haven't thought about that question. We have to, in my list. Thank you.
That's a good question, though. What is the function of education if it's not part of this economy that we're in? If it's not to be credentialed, not to achieve the qualification? I think that's another way of asking this same question of how do we do this other thing in this system that we're in, right? Which is the sort of question that we keep coming back to in the question of education and the commons that has no easy answer. I don't have an answer for that except to say that it's not good enough to just say, oh, forget about the symbolic capital you're seeking to accumulate here because we're now going to do something else, more cooperative, right? I mean, obviously, we live in this world now, and folks need to do what they need to do. The question is how to see openings and pursue openings in spite of those systems that we're living within. There's a long-standing debate in the United States, or question around, particularly around students of color, critiques of white progressive educators for insisting on progressive and critical pedagogies without equipping students with the symbolic capital, the codes of power, as Lisa Delpit puts it, that they need to survive in the society. Of course, it's not enough, I think, to just say, school is about getting ahead, so we're going to give you this stuff. Can we do both? Can we do both? That's the challenge. That doesn't necessarily open a revolutionary new horizon, right? But we have to be able to think complexly, I think, about these questions.
May I also say a small comment on this? Like, it will be a different symbolic capital if we have an onto shift in the broader society. So we cannot have, I mean, it is the chicken and the egg, you know, so can we reformulate or rephrase what could be a symbolic capital taken from a schooling process within a society that we hope that the society, if we manage to shift the mentality and the ontology of the educational system, something must be happening at the same time at the broader society. So there will be an onto shift in the symbolic capital of the society that will be reflected differently. A small personal, very small personal perspective is that I've been a social activist for the last 23 years. I would never expect shifting from engineering to education and researcher that my experience as an activist would count as positive in my CV to be a social researcher and scientist. I would never thought about that. 20 years back, I might be afraid of police following me. I might be afraid of getting arrested. And now it's something that counts positively on my CV, and I place that I have such these years of activism. So there is a broader shifting. And there is a symbolic capital of attending this conference certificate too. We must decompose these two. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentations. You are both talking about this reconceptualization education and co-creating new realities. And to me, elaborating with the what if and creating alternative realities is very much what arts and culture is about. And also, of course, the work of the artists within different expressions. So my question is if you have any examples of where collaborations with the artists or the environment of arts and culture have had any permanent impact on the educational structures.
Permanent impact is a lot, but I think that, and Monica, she knows as well very well in Barcelona, but last years, this idea of that someone who's an artist in different disciplines, music or sculpture or dance or whatever, they stay for some months in one school with not a clear plan, but just starting to co-create what could happen. I guess it's a real concrete, small but concrete example of what we are talking about. this idea that sometimes learning, it's too structured, too enclosed. It's like, for example, in the British educational system, this is very clear. The people, when they are 16, they have to do the GCSE exams. And the GCSE exam is this one. You have to learn, you have to put inside your mind, and with this you have a 10 over 10. It's like that. Question this kind, no. It's this one inside your brain, and then you can reproduce it. So anything that could be against that, so an open relationship that starts to co-create something that is not unpackaged, that is not enclosed. It's a good expression, it's a good experience of what could look like educational commons in many different respects. The same for sports, the same for drama, the same for, but one day you have to start thinking about the same for philosophy, the same for, or thinking or doing or biology. Because if not, we are doing all the time a tricky question is like, let's do research-based projects, but I know the answer. And what I want is that you arrives to me, to hear. You can do this way, the other one, but it's not a truly open, it's not related to what your community, it's not related to your own problems, it's not related to your reality, it's not related to your history, it's not related to, it's related to what I want. So I guess that all these experiences, for example, their artist residences in schools, that they start from an open point with no, there's not a closed plan, is really interesting because that allows teachers, students, families, and artists to co-create something together that have a final result that can be shown, but it's not an enclosed one. So I guess that sometimes the arts can help us to do this I don't know to say the word in English. Performative, advancing the future, So I guess it's really interesting. And those experiences, for example, in the city of Barcelona or many other cities, is like something with time, no structure, no planning, no enclosed, and they stay for months there, and they happen different things with the small one or coordinate different ages, etc. So they are interesting, I guess, really interesting and powerful experiences there that can help us to figure it out what good looks like. It was a good answer? No, because your face is like no.
No, it's like I think this kind of projects, the reflections, I would say, they are often fantastic. This is a fantastic collaboration. But what about the impact in the longer run? If you have...
We don't know.
No. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the arts are very important and very generative as a space from which to begin all this work, which is why they're pushed to the absolute margins of the school curriculum, precisely because of that, I think. I think they're, in terms of real impact, I want to give one example that I think is very interesting. And I don't know how much of this has reached Europe or how much is happening in Europe, but there's a real tradition now of hip-hop-based education, rap-based education, that is a whole scholarly tradition now. And it argues for and describes how to bring what is originally, a vernacular African-American musical idiom into the space of the school in ways that are authentic and critical and that are culturally relevant. And of course, like with all of this stuff we're talking about, that can go in different directions. And of course, this music is already commodified in different ways, and you can serve the same basic purposes of the curriculum. All those contradictions are there. But I think that this tradition has had a real impact on our understandings of literacy, on our understandings of the relationship of the official curriculum to students' home cultures. So in colleges of education, practices have been altered as a result, for instance, of this tradition and others like it. That doesn't mean it's, all good or that, we don't have to deal with these same issues. But I do think that's an impact that is meaningful, and that there are many others we could look to in the case of the arts. But it at least in where I come from, it's a real emergency, because the arts are just clinging on by their fingertips to any space in the school at all, with the mandates coming down and the standards such as they are.
Okay. So, an interesting discussion. Thank you very much. So I'm thinking of the previous question about education as a symbolic value. And you're coming from a Marxist perspective, and it came to mind the concept of use value and exchange value. So the symbolic value of education could be thought of as an exchange value, right? So then you're asking, what is the use value of education? And an immediate thought is, for example, Bildung, or Bildung, the German concept of Bildung, and understanding. But then I continue to think about, we are a whole group here from Sweden in the Smooth Brothers, and we work with the very youngest students, children from 1 year and up. And when we very, 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 very carefully listening to them, as Noah said in your presentation, do we ask the small children what they think about the world, the natural, the social, the cultural, the technological world? The first thing is, do we? But if we do, we experience a lot of interesting thoughts, that small children are curious about the world. They're super curious about everything. They want to understand, they want to learn. So if that would be the starting point in an educational system, to listen, to develop projects together with them and explore the world through play, through art, the 100 languages that they talk about in Reggio Emilia. How could this then transfer, or what would be the next step in the educational system? How would that be taken and used creatively in the next step for the children in the educational system? And could this be a thought about, or in terms of the concepts of common? So that's my question.
Can I say, I think that's deep. I think that's really important and interesting. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, who's a Canadian writer, indigenous writer and educator, talks about students being asked for their consent to be taught. She raises that question. She says in indigenous communities, students' consent is important for the process. It's a collective project. It's one that's entered into willingly. But do we ever even ask that basic question? Do I have your consent to teach you? I don't know. And then the other questions, the genuine interest in students' perspective on matters that we often think as purely adult concerns, not just academic, but otherwise. So actually, I would ask you, I'm curious, because you said, could this be a starting point? I'm wondering if you have in mind, from your experience, where that leads, those questions and that curiosity about what children think and say. Do you see that leading to other steps in this work of commoning education?
have these wonderful projects in our preschools, but then when they start first grade, then it's a totally different kind of system, and they are not asked anymore. So it's like a lot what you say. They're not asked anymore. What do they think? What's their interest, and what do they think about what theories do they have, etc., etc. So now they are kind of being told what to, how things are, kind of. So that's the problem. So how could school look like continuing that kind of mode of teaching and education? I don't have the answer, but I see that there is a stop to it when they end preschool.
We prepare a project about how to reshape the educare system in Barcelona, in Milano, and in Tampere. And one of the things that we did was to reread some classics like Malaguzzi, as you said, or Froebel. So one of the most interesting things that Froebel said when he talks about the kindergarten was that it has to be something diverse, that the kindergarten has to gather all the town or the village children. And I guess this is something that I don't know in your country, but in other countries are happening on the contrary. And the kindergartens are becoming something that they start with these competition logics, as you said, In some countries, they left children to be children until the year of 6, 7, and then we have to start with the serious thing, But in some countries, even the 3 years old, they become to be a place that they say, because the neuroscience says that it's really important at this age, let's start doing a lot of things, instrumental thing, related to the future learnings, not listening children, not related to their interest, etc., but related to the instrumental, the future marks, the future titles, etc. So I guess, again, that 06 education, that it used to be something really interesting because it was destructured, was really listening the children, etc. Now is a line of battle related to this idea of capture it and use it not for the creativity, the interest of the world, curiosity, etc., but on the contrary, to closing it, to put tables, to put chairs, to sit children then and to start to doing all that could be, So I guess it's really important, as you said, to question what's happening there and to do not lose this battle, because I guess it's at least in my country it's happening, that some kindergartens that used to be really open, like common spaces with families inside, etc., they are becoming more and more schooled, so enclosed. So I guess it's a real danger there.
Can I dare to also ask a question or pose a comment? So I just would like to ask for a comment, if some of you have, about what we call post-digital. Like, there is a discussion that we have to see as merged the natural world and the digital world, and stop thinking in duality anymore, because we live merged in both worlds. I used to say also that our grandfathers had to fight for democracy in one world, and we have to fight for democracy in two worlds. So don't get stressed too much. Also, let's say that from the digital commoners, okay, because we talked about the past, the indigenous communities, the medieval period, nowadays commons of care, etc., etc. But I wanted also to put in our radar that there is a huge collaboration, a huge production of stuff in the digital world in a horizontal peer-to-peer way, in a digital commons, in a commons way, commons-based way. So from Wikipedia to a multiverse of smaller open source and commons-based projects, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people that they invent ways to collaborate in an horizontal way that are different from the physical commons in some aspects, because it's a different physicality, it's a different space. So they have peer governance among so many people. They share ontologies and rules and imaginaries in their communities that makes 200,000 of people to collaborate. Okay, so the scale is huge. And of course, it's not that they don't have contradictions. There are huge contradictions in it, but there are contradictions in all the other communities that we investigate too. So I just wanted to put into our radar also the digital commons as a companions also to this trip and enriching our knowledge, because also they are very much based as a knowledge commons, right? So it's very close to us. So both as a digital world for the people, but at the same time as lessons that we can take and crystallized experience from thousands of people that also collaborating in the digital realm in a peer-to-peer and commons-based way.
I haven't thought much about that. I'm sorry about that. Just to be aware that we need to question what's happening inside or on the internet as the other side. For example, some people try to explain to me that the MOOCs are a revolution on pedagogical way. No, MOOCs are the transmissive way that it has been for centuries. So sometimes just because it's on the screen, it's better than, but I guess no. So we have to be the same, we have to have the same critical perspective on that. It's the only thing that I could say, but no more than that because I haven't thought.
It's also a little bit out of my expertise as well, though I will say the projects you allude to, I know, are indeed very important, and that this struggle between enclosure and commoning is playing out in this digital space as we speak, in terms of the tech giants and their control of the internet and the rest of it. That's a real important political battle. I think to sort of build on what Jordi was saying is how do those questions touch down in the classroom space? And I think the trick is to make what's interesting there and provocative available to students and teachers. And so often it's not that. What it is another set of requirements and apps that you have to use as a teacher and make sure you're doing this technological thing, even at the university, right? Which becomes a kind of imposition and a kind of fetishism of technology that is absolutely not what you're talking about. And so the trick is, what would be interesting is to how can we make the connection so that it's about that common space that people can investigate in a genuine way and not merely a sort of fetishism of the technology.
Thank you. Again, sorry if I am speaking too much. I come from a country which is actually at the vanguard of edutech, Estonia. And it is, Alekos, you know this, that they have different phases. There is the idea of the neoliberal market in which you use technology to equip young people with certain skills that would be useful in the future for programming, whatever it is. But also there is, and I would say that is something really interesting that we are researching in the Smooth project there, which is how young people develop skills to be able to master those instruments, but also to guide them collectively in a way that they are addressing the fundamental needs that they see within their community. So we need to be also very critical of, media literacy and how we are managing our devices, as Jordi was pointing out, but they definitely can be a source, a rich source of learning of any source, right? The point needs to be horizontal, it needs to be agreed upon, and being very, very critical on those aspects of the market. Thank you.
Any other reflection? Yes, please.
Hi there. Thank you for your interesting presentations. And because you introduced it like this is a therapy session, so I want to share some thoughts I had and an observation, because we were talking about the starting point of where we can start to think about education. And one thought I had was that we asked about what could be the alternative to symbolic capital. What can we do? How we can use this? What is the outcome of? Maybe we should start asking different questions to a very different kind of thinking to perform other educational processes.
Just to be part of this last part of the session, of the therapy session, with Stephen, we try to think this idea that the commons fits a lot with Foucauldian idea that education should be an ethical and political activity. You know, and this idea of ethical and political activity, it concretes in 4 ideas: to learn to take care of oneself, to take care of others, to take care of community, and to take care of environment. When you took this perspective, some of the questions that have been here disappear because it's about another thing. It's something that we, for sure, we learned from the feminist approaches related to to put life in the center, to take care, etc. But the same from the environmental people, that they are questioning us a lot. You know, it's like, what are you doing, guys, about education? You are forming people that are destroying the world. You are forming this. So I guess it's interesting, your reflection, to end it up, because it's that probably if we start from different points, if we start from different questions, or we start from different practices, probably some of the questions and the anxieties that we have probably will disappear. So I guess it's a really interesting reflection to end it up, at least for me.
Yes, I appreciate that too. And you know, there are many obstacles and constraints we face, but at least for teachers, we face these basic questions of purposes, of orientation, of ethics. Those are within our purview, and there's no escape from them, in fact. And they're very important. And so in my classes, it's always interesting to me when I pose those questions to my students and I say, what you're doing is very, very important. This work that you're taking on as a teacher, there's really nothing more important than that. It goes against all the messages they have absorbed, all the sense that they are not valuable, that they are just doing what they're told, that they're functionaries. But it's precisely because those basic questions of purpose and value and orientation are part of the work. And when those can be made available to future teachers in a real way, and they can have a sense of the importance of their work and their responsibility, their deep responsibility, that's a very powerful thing. You know, whatever obstacles they will then face, which we know are many. Thank you for the question.
So let's close the session. If you allow me 3 small comments just to close it. We had a Zoom with Noah and before coming here, and he was preoccupied about how much or not he would be into the context that we want to discuss. So I just want to comment that how common contexts and preoccupations we have and views and visions. And I'm sure that if there were here people also from the Global South, etc., around the commons, we would have the same preoccupations and the same context. So we have some commons-based anxieties, maybe. The second comment is about the time, that we had 1.5 hours left due, that was present from our Melissa Nola's time. But again, there was such an interesting discussion and the peer-to-peer discussion that this seems that we could go on even more. And a last comment on a lot of neo going on about neoliberalism and etc. And we are speaking about post-post, you know, like post-capitalism and post-colonialism. And maybe I see we have started talking about prefigurative and prefigurative. And we saw how much grounded we are also in the practice. So it is at the same time a theoretical discussion, but also very much grounded as both of you replied with very much practical ways that you do in your teaching or that you envision. And many people from this conference and researchers are here to discuss about our case study. So I really think that it is a powerful discussion and conference, because it is as much visionary in the theoretical perspective, it is also grounded in actual practice. So post and pre. So thanks a lot and see you tomorrow.